Well, welcome y'all. Thanks for joining us for a conversation on urban gathering. All of us are Atlantans by choice or by birth, and we're really excited to talk about not just what it means to bring modern community together, but also a lot of what the challenges are to do that, particularly in this time. Would love to just start by having each of you just introduce yourselves, and not a bio, but instead just who you are, and kind of what brought you to community in 2 sentences or less.
Cool. Hey, y'all, I'm Darrah. I am a connector by nature, which is what brought me to community, is that it's the foundation for what I believe is important in this world, that we have to connect with one another. It's how doors are opened. It's how we find fulfillment and, frankly, more fun.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Wilson. Community really found me. I'm an introvert by nature, and I'm in law school thinking about why the community that I had in undergrad kind of went away really quickly. It led me to open a private membership club here in Atlanta and then buy a music conference and festival that's centered around bringing people together.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenn Graham, and I fell into community on my way to work. I had a bike accident that literally launched me into community engagement for the Atlanta Bicycle Coalition, trying to make Atlanta more bike-friendly. And what I learned in community advocacy through that, I started applying to other elements of community design, and started Civic dinners to help bring people together around the issues they care about.
I think it's also cool, just because I've never asked each of you that question, just to hear kind of what the difference is in how we got there, that it can come from introversion, that it can come from a calling, that it can come from a car ride. It's like this idea of where we find it and how we feel connected to one another really takes its own shape. I'd love to start, just given that we're at Gathering Smart City, a lot of what Smart City is talking about today is more than just technology and software and big data, but actually what is sort of the values of a smart city. Inclusion or social equity or economic mobility. And I think it's pretty obvious to a lot of Americans today that there are a lot of historical lines that have been drawn through communities, that we see a lot of gaps that are widening among communities, wealth gaps, education gaps, opportunity gaps, race gaps, you name it. It really feels like there's widening gaps. And so in that environment, how do we build cohesive community? If we want diversity and we love the word inclusion and we think about all these wonderful values that often feel very buzzy, how do we actually do that in a time when honestly it feels like we're getting more pulled apart?
Okay. Well, we started Civic dinners at a time when Atlanta was going through some rough patches. We had cheating scandals on national news for our APS public school system. We had just failed to pass a major transportation referendum that promised to unclog our roadways. And we had the snowpocalypse that put us on SNL for weeks on Saturday nights. And so I really decided, fell into, we've got to change the narrative around Atlanta. We have to, we love Atlanta. The Beltline's coming. This is, back in 2013, 2014. Let's bring people together, talk about what we love about Atlanta, and refocus on what we love, what we appreciate, what we admire. And let's talk about what we would love to love. Maybe it's not here now, but what could we work on to bring here? And that really brought to get people to the table who genuinely cared about Atlanta, its future, and found a way to dive in. So I think by creating that simple space and a safe inviting, I think the key to your point, how do we bridge these gaps is invitations. You have to invite them to the table. Sometimes it's intimidating to, how do I show up at a city council meeting? Or do I feel invited to this event? Is this for me? And just making sure that more people know that they are welcome, and finding creative ways to make them feel even more welcome and less intimidated when they come to the table.
I think, in addition to that, the word I like to use is being intentional. When we started the process of looking at opening a private club, there were a lot of old rules that were written about the space that we really had to start to unpack and rewrite. An easy one was just looking at industries. I'm proud every day that you will see folks wearing suits and ties and t-shirts and jeans sitting right next to each other. That's a really intentional effort on our part, though, to try to explain to two groups that ordinarily really would never sit next to each other during the day that this is a space for them. It sounds simple, but it really just began by saying, hey, I really want y'all to sit next to each other. I think that's the same thing that you'll see in the work that we're all doing, is that it a lot of times takes taking a step back and getting to a very simple solve, which is just, hey, let's chat.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I want to add to that is that you have to meet people where they are before you can push them, and that you can find the way to connect people diversely with that same intention. So with me, one of the communities that I created is called Network Under 40, and it started because a friend had graduated from undergrad with me at Emory, and she said, where do I go where I won't get hit on, sold to, everyone's my parents' age or in my industry? And I laughed, and I was like, that doesn't exist. But so I thought, it doesn't matter where you live in town, what your race is, what your religion is, what you do for work. We all want to feel connected. And so if we could find a place to do that and then push them a little bit outside of their boundaries to say, we're not going to show up and just ask really basic questions. We're not going to just say, what do you do? How can I transact with you? We're going to ask deeper questions that really break the ice and get people deeply connected more authentically, so you can continue to push that intention that Ryan's talking about to trickle down into their conversations that span outside of that, which I think if you can just have that starting point with people, that's where the community can build and it can trickle out.
So here today, when we go to these big summits, especially for introverts, it can be like really daunting to kind of cruise around and actually figure out a way to even build this kind of like almost what you're describing, all of you, is a process. It's the end goal, but to almost get over that first hurdle of like, how do you actually authentically connect? I was at this event in New York 2 nights ago, and Alexis Ohanian, who's Serena's husband, was there, and like such a fanboy. I was like, I just want to talk to Alexis, and I couldn't quite find the sort of authentic way to approach. And so you all are community builders. How do you get people to drop the facade? How do you get people to actually put themselves out there? Because yeah, sometimes that intro kind of sucks. Sometimes it doesn't actually go well. Sometimes a person doesn't want to talk to you. And if what we're really looking for is authentic connection, how do you create a community to get people there fast?
Well, I'm going to borrow from Brene Brown really fast and talk about that importance of vulnerability, and not in the sense of like, let me show up and dump all my shit on your doorstep and like cry. And it's not that. It's just, if I were Brendan and I wanted to talk to Alexis Ohanian, I would have just been like, man, I'm such a fan of yours, and I'm like palpitating, my heart is palpitating over in the corner. And that's disarming, and that makes people want to connect with you. So just allowing and modeling that for someone allows them to do the same back for you and open up a space. And another, this sounds a little bit trite, but offering someone a compliment that is sincere. Like I was walking down here on the elevator and there was a woman directing me, and she looked beautiful, and I said, you look gorgeous. And we instantly had a connection and could talk, and otherwise she just would have been someone I walked by. And she's someone who is contributing to this event, to this city, in a way that I noticed her, and that matters.
One of the things that we tried to do early was we removed technology from the equation and made people sit in a space and actually talk to one another. I used to hate the question, like, where is your app? And like, it was painful because we actually had an app, but I refused to release it because I wanted people to actually like come to the events and set that as a part of our culture first. Once that was developed, then we released the app, and that's an amazing tool now to connect people. But it started with us saying, hey, look, put down your cell phones for a second and like say hi, right? Yeah, tell the person next to them that you actually want to speak. Again, these principles are super simple, but in a world where there's like so much content on our phones, it's hard for us to look away, and it makes connecting in real life. It pains me when people say, well, like, I know you from the internet. I'm like, well, you don't know me really at all. You've seen photos or like of me maybe, but like for us to actually get some work done, we're gonna have to like have a conversation.
This happened to me yesterday. I was at a networking event, ran into an old friend. She goes, oh, how are you? And I go, great. And then I'm like, well, actually, I'm okay. I'm working on, and I think it's just, we're so ingrained in kind of just putting on a face and going through the motions and saying, it's awesome, it's going well, it's going great. And that's kind of end of conversation, right? It's just like, how's the weather? It's great. And so I think for us, we take intentional conversation to a real structured format with the Civic dinner, and that it's meant to be intended. intimate, and that real change doesn't happen necessarily in an auditorium or in rows, but it happens in circles and small groups where you can actually exchange ideas and have deeper discussions on a meaningful topic that you care about. And like those dinner table conversations that you've had with friends over long times, especially over bottles of wine, tend to kind of, people go deeper. And so we try to intentionally create that arc to where when you start with a personal story, people are curious. If you're naturally curious about someone's story or their perspective on something, they open up in a heartbeat, and they often go really deep if they feel like they're in a safe space to do so. So starting personally before you get into kind of, well, what do you think about immigration? More of like, do you know, like, what's your, if it is like, oh, well, where are you from? And tell me a story about your background, or where, I mean, that's off the top of my head, but we have other conversations on very specific topics from bridging the racial divide, like where you grew up and your first moment of understanding race is like a kind of a way to really kind of open up your own personal perspective to that issue. Nobody can argue with that, because I think what most people are really afraid of in getting in those conversations is not being an expert and not wanting to get into a debate. That's the two biggest fears of like not seeming smart enough, or getting into an argument with someone who's able to kind of zap the stats or build something up. So yeah, I would say stick to personal stories.
I want to like zoom out from just the more personal level and look at sort of city level. And I know all of you have talked a little bit about this idea of, there's a lot of cities that are becoming or are known as sort of one-trick pony cities, right? DC is politics and government, Silicon Valley is tech, LA is entertainment. Is that a good thing, to have a sort of unifying theme that brings a city together and tries to move us forward in one community, or does that actually have the opposite effect and further not include those who actually don't identify with that? I lived in DC, and there's artists there. They don't necessarily feel as deeply connected to government. So what do you think?
I think initially it could be a good thing when, particularly like in Silicon Valley, when things are going well. But over time, it starts to fade, right? I mean, one of the things that I love about Atlanta the most is that there really is no identity that the city has to a particular industry. If you think about it, we have really large companies here. I think it's still the third highest concentration of Fortune 500 headquarters that are here. We have a creative class in film and music that's being created here. And then we have a lot of companies that are being started. And those industries know one another really well, which is cool about this city. And I think as we look to like what the future of cities that are going to be doing really well, what they look like, it'll look a lot like Atlanta. And so yeah, I know I get why cities do it, and it works for branding purposes early, but as much diversity as you can have to make sure that the tent is big for everyone to come and participate should be a goal, I think, going forward.
And there's ways to broaden it out. Like I think back to our old slogan in Atlanta, which was the city too busy to hate, which was like one of many. And that's unifying, and that's a brand, and that's something people can come behind and get around that has nothing to do with your industry.
So maybe it's around a value, not an identity, or not a a title. Is that
I can't see her, but I think Kate Atwood's in the audience. Like, for example, when she took over Choose ATL or really brought it off the ground, for her, she wanted to get back to the idea of innovation, that this is the seed of the civil rights movement. There's all these other innovative foundations that were at the base of Atlanta. And again, that's a theme, it's a value, it's a mantra almost.
Definitely. When we did the Millennial Advisory Panel and asked millennials across the region, what do they care, what do they love most about Atlanta, they found the number one thing was diversity. The sheer numbers of, we have like, I don't know how many, I mean, Clarkston, an example, is in the region. It's the most diverse square mile in the country. But there's a difference between diversity and inclusion, and making sure people feel welcome and invited no matter what, because we're also one of the most segregated regions where people are living in their own pockets. So I think, yes, honoring what we love and appreciate, but also how do we celebrate diversity? And that meaning it's almost like a brand. If Atlanta can own, I mean, the fact that we were the home of the Civil War, the birthplace of the civil rights, and now can we be the home of civil discourse and give people the brave, intentional times to really talk about what matters?
So tell me one of your favorite communities that's not your own that you've created, and why that is.
Okay, I'll go first. So I don't know if everyone knows, but this is a little secret. Brendan's my fiance, and the community that I'm going to say is actually where we met, and it has nothing to do with that, but it's called Breakout. And the reason that I like it is, one, I love their mission. They go to cities that I think are underappreciated, and they take you behind the curtain and under the hood to experience them in a way that you probably never would, whether or not you're a native or you're a tourist. And I love that they bring together a group of people that probably wouldn't have met otherwise, and I hope no one will be offended by this language, but no one's dick swinging, male or female. And what I mean by that is no one is there wearing their own ego. It's about how can we collaborate? How can we help and pour resources into places that people here are asking? And how can we listen and learn before we prescribe?
For me, I think, and I'm going to talk about a community that I actually can't go to anymore, which is sad, but I think the university context is super interesting, and we don't pay enough attention to that model in other, like, basically after you can't go anymore, like most of us. But if you sit back and think about it, what other place can you go to where there are people from all over the world that are studying different things, that you have space to talk about different issues and do that through dining and do it through academic study? I don't know why we give up that model later in life, and we leave it to a very specific time period. But like the fundamentals of what happens there, I can't tell you anything about my classes. I went to Georgetown in DC, and I'm sure my professors would not enjoy hearing me say that. I can't tell you my class schedule for my sophomore year, but I can tell you about the experiences, and I think that that's true for many of us. It just kind of disappears when you turn 23. So I miss that model, and I think that we are replicating parts of it, and ultimately I think that's what people want to do in some form or fashion.
Do you feel like, because at a university, right, you sort of have this common purpose, right? You're all Georgetown undergrads or grads, and you also have a set of rules that are in place with actual like real, with real enforcement mechanisms in place as well. And there's values that are often inherent, like if it's a faith-based school, for instance. Sure. Do you feel like those elements are actually critical to a community? And so, for instance, when you're building the gathering spot, like you try to figure out how to have that North Star, how to have those rules structured, how to have some of the enforcement pieces in place, or was that just something that happened there but wasn't necessary to create that community?
No, it's actually the model that we study the most, right? Because my business partner was my roommate in college, and so the process of starting the business was really us exploring why we didn't communicate even with one another as much as we did a year before. And it was because we had lost that context of, proximity was a piece of it. We were no longer 4 feet away from each other in a room. That we were happy about that part, but sad that we couldn't see everybody else. He's from the U.S. Virgin Islands. I would have no reason to know him if it weren't for that setting. And I think these principles are almost universal. It's not so much my college experience, but the thing that universities have just figured out generally that we should tap into more.
I think you mentioned some proximity, which is so crucial. We are social beings, and the more smart we become, the smarter technologies that we're using, those smart technologies often are taking us away from interactions. You can now go your entire day without interacting with a single human by having groceries delivered to you. In the future, autonomous vehicle take you to where you need to go. Maybe you work remotely, but that has consequences that we have to talk about. And how do we intentionally design interactions? The fact that the Beltline, is a little piece of sidewalk and has created so much blossoming momentum and all across Atlanta and billions of dollars of investment, but its design is to connect people, to connect the humans and create opportunities for people to kind of bump into one another. So I think the key to creating community is creating that opportunity for collisions to happen between people and ideas and make it comfortable and easy for people, just like even having chairs, even having benches can create that opportunity for conversation and connection with people.
I think that's the starting point, and I'm sorry if we're going in a different direction. I think a mistake that we make a lot when we're talking about building communities is that we talk too much about space and not all of the stuff that fills those spaces. Part of our business is looking at co-working, right? So that's We have an area that you can, there's private workstations and conference rooms. But I tell people all the time, like, we are not in the space business because tables and chairs don't really make what we do. I think a lot of people are making that mistake. They think that if they put a desk out or a table and a chair out, that people instinctively will like gather and be in community, and it takes more work than that. That oftentimes I don't see being done.
Really quickly, one thing that's worth looking up if you've never read it before, it came out of the Harvard Divinity School. It's called the Unchurched Generation, and it talks about how, our generation of millennials and those coming up behind us are in massive amounts unchurched, no matter how you define that, and how there are communities that are doing a great job to fill that void, and those models are really powerful that they describe in the study.
Yeah, one model is actually CrossFit. It's a really powerful sense of community that's galvanized in one single North Star with a whole support structure in place that Harvard goes deep into. I want to open it up for a few minutes and ask if there's any questions that someone would like to ask. What you can do is just stand up, ask it, and then I'll repeat it so that everyone hears.
Not all at once.
The big table or on the table? Yeah.
One of the problems that we have is that, like, people who we get to come to dinner are individual systems. You know what I mean? So it's like,
Yeah.
we hang out downtown and, like,
Yeah.
so, like, what's your experience in getting people who may not feel like they're part of the crowd?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Do you want to just repeat the question?
Yes, I'll repeat the question. So, On the Table is an initiative that started in Chicago, and it's funded by the Knight Foundation, where they bring people together, invite people to the table to have conversations about their community, which is similar to an initiative we're launching called the Lovable City. But basically, it's talking about bringing people together to uncover the most important issues facing the city. But the challenge is the challenge is how do you get unusual suspects to come to the table? We've struggled with this too, especially when we first started, which is why we've angled it to now create diverse host committees, essentially, to start reaching out to a network of people who just, first of all, care about their community and are natural gatherers, like Darrah and you. So we try to collect both geographic diversity and demographic diversity. So we think, let's create a host committee of maybe 25 people initially, and make sure that they cover all the neighborhoods and ask them to host a dinner or a conversation on a particular topic. Then we encourage them to reach out to their networks, go deeper into the community, partnerships with whether it's the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce or the faith community, and kind of make sure we're touching all components and build partnerships with a lot of ways. And then if you create it, the beauty of On the Table, or even with Lovable City that we're launching all in October, is that you have a density. The proximity is like we have a single location. It's anywhere in Atlanta. We've got a bunch of hosts. So it's basically taking the Uber model of drivers and riders. You have hosts and guests. And then you're driving a ton of different people to go to the site and find a dinner that works for their schedule or their timing. So you're kind of mixing the pot a bit rather than just relying on the host to reach out to their same people, and creating more diverse opportunities to bump into people that they may not have had already.
This is another one of those topics where I think that there's a simple solve to something that feels more complex. One of my favorite quotes in life is, "Do you really want to win or look good losing?" And I ask my team and myself that all the time because, it really is just about setting specific goals. What does the room need to look like? If we were going to reinvent the private club model, I wanted it to not be a good old boys club, which meant having more women than men in the club from a membership base from the start. We set a threshold, 60%, and have stuck to it, right? It's just, that is the thing that we do. And if it ever starts to waver, we stop and evaluate and figure out how to create strategies to either bring in new hosts or whatever. We had a shortage of educators at one point, stopped, and we're super intentional about trying to go and get people that were in that space. So I think, again, do you really want to win or look good losing when you're curating rooms? If you want to win, it takes sometimes that extra 2 steps, to go out into rooms that you haven't been in before and like invite folks, talk about shared values, why it's important that they're there. In our experience, most of the time people will come.
Any more questions? Yep, go ahead. So the question's about long-term relationships and how do you move beyond the kind of one-off dinner, and have you all seen that?
We haven't had a civic dinner marriage yet, but I'm
We have.
hoping. Oh, she got it. But we've had people start businesses together, including the Lola, which we're headed to after this. It's just similar. It's a women's-only club, basically, for women. Anybody could come and work from there as well. And they actually met at a State of Women civic dinner 3 years ago, and now they just launched the Lola, all about creating a community for women. We've had other teams go launch nonprofits together to support transit referendums across the region. We've had so a lot of people have found best friends that they normally wouldn't have met had they not shown up to that dinner. And I think the randomness is what creates that, and the intimacy. The randomness plus the intimacy creates that instant bond and connection that can withstand time and the distance between the next meetup. But it's really up to them to kind of take that next step and initiate those relationships.
So we've had a lot of the same results with a very different type of environment, but for me, I think a lot of it had to do with the initial intention and culture setting from the jump 11 years ago. And that had to do with, okay, here is the catalyst, but what do you do with it when you're outside of this room? And so we also empower them by, like, I made a 27 video series of explaining to people, what do you do when you meet someone? What do you do when you're feeling uncomfortable? What do you do after? Like, I give them the tools to empower themselves, and we message that very clearly. So it's like, here's the place that you can meet because you're probably struggling to do it in the rest of your life. It can feel awkward and uncomfortable, but we're not the end-all be-all. And then we continue to have 1 to 2 events a month so that they can come back and reconnect, both with the people that they met as well as a new pool of people.
All right, we're out of time, so I'm going to end with, I'm going to start a sentence, you're going to finish it. It can only be one sentence, so it's going to be quick, it's going to be fast. So the first is, the hardest thing about building community is?
One sentence. Oh. Understanding the difference between space and like actually doing the work of bringing people together. That's
Awesome.
one sentence, right?
It was, yeah.
Probably had a
Had a comma, but
Yeah, cool.
The hardest thing about building community is understanding that people have different wants and needs.
I'd say the hardest part about building community is finding the one thing that's going to rally them together to do something meaningful.
And then the last is, what I know to be true about community is?
What I know to be true about community is that it's a lifeline, and it's the lifeline.
It's universal. It's a fundamental need that we all have.
Yeah, I forgot the prompt.
Me too. That's why I went straight into it.
Do I even remember my question? No, what I know to be true about community is?
What I know to be true about community is that it's all about love and relationships.
It's all about love, y'all. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you being here.